We wanted to do something special today. We're giving the jet to Sabrina. Sabrina!
Giving her what, exactly?
The jet, sweetheart. She has a husband and 2 kids. She needs it more than you do.
Great timing. I've got contacts in Europe worth meeting.
Trevor already talked to the crew. We're thinking Monaco, then Paris. Who paid for that aircraft?
You mostly use it for work anyway.
My mother was glowing. My father looked completely at ease. My sister was already planning her first trip overseas. Not one of them asked me. They had spent years learning that my refusals bent, that my anger cooled, and my answers always changed. They weren't giving anyone a plane. They were testing a pattern. So what would they learn the day my answer finally stayed no? If you've ever been the one everyone assumed would just figure it out, the capable one, the strong one, the one who always came through this story is going to hit close to home. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. My mother once told me that the reason she never worried about me was because I was always going to be fine. She said it like a compliment. She meant it like one. I was 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with a failed math test tucked under my thigh, watching her make dinner and explain to my younger sister Sabrina why it was okay that she'd lost her part in the school play. My mother held Sabrina's face in both hands and told her she was sensitive and talented and that the world didn't always recognize those things right away. Then she looked over at me and said, almost as an afterthought, that I was strong and that strong people didn't need as much reassurance. I nodded. I put the test in my backpack. I figured out math on my own. That was the first time I understood the rule, even if I couldn't have named it yet. There were 2 daughters in the Ashford house. One of them needed protecting. The other one was assumed to be fine. And for the next 2 decades, that assumption quietly shaped everything, what was offered, what was expected, and what was never once thought to ask about. Growing up in Florida, we were what most people would call a comfortable family, though my father, Gerald, preferred the word established. He worked in industrial equipment distribution, which was steadier than glamorous, and my mother, Marlene, channeled whatever gap existed between their real life and their ideal one into the way she dressed, the people she cultivated, and the image she carefully maintained at every dinner party and country club function she attended as a guest of other people's memberships. Appearances were Marlene's second language. She spoke it fluently and expected the rest of us to keep up. What I understood even as a child was that the performance of stability cost something, and that the cost was never distributed equally. Sabrina was 5 years younger than me and occupied a position in that household that I can only describe as protected. Not spoiled. Exactly, it was more specific than that. When things went wrong for Sabrina, the family converged. When things went wrong for me, I was reminded that I was capable. Both of those things were true, technically. But one of them was a response, and the other was a reason to stop responding. I don't think my parents designed it that way. I think it grew from 1,000 small decisions made without examination, each one reinforcing the last, until the shape of it was so familiar that no one thought to question whether it was fair. By the time I was a teenager, I had stopped expecting anyone to notice the difference. I had started working instead. By the time I was 20, I had already found my footing in logistics. Not because someone guided me there, I had been trying to figure out how to stop depending on a family that had quietly decided I didn't need much. I found an entry point in medical supply chains, specifically the part of the business that nobody wanted to think about, the movement of time, sensitive equipment, and critical cargo across long distances, under pressure, with very little margin for error. I was good at it because I had been trained by my own life to perform well under exactly those conditions. Urgency didn't rattle me. Complexity didn't slow me down. I had been solving problems alone since I was 12 years old, and it turned out that skill had a market value. The years between 20 and 34 were not glamorous. I rented an office that was too small, hired people I sometimes couldn't pay on time, and drove the kind of car that made no impression on anyone. But I kept building. I kept showing up. And I kept noticing opportunities that other people missed because they weren't willing to stay close enough to the problem to see them. By my early 30s, my company was operating across multiple international markets, coordinating medical logistics between the United States, Europe, and the Middle East for hospital networks and healthcare corporations that needed precision more than they needed personality. When I sold a significant portion of my equity stake at 34, the number that came back was one that my family had no reference point for. Neither did I, honestly. But I knew exactly what I had given to get it. Every missed holiday. Every birthday attended by phone. Every time I had chosen the work because the work was the one thing that had never let me down. After the sale, I purchased a long-range private jet. It was customized, purpose-built, and worth $68 million. I ran the decision through 3 separate legal structures before I signed anything, and the aircraft was registered under one of my holding companies, not in my personal name, not in any name anyone else in my family would recognize on a document. I bought it because the work required it. I was flying between continents multiple times a month to meet partners, review investments, and attend meetings that couldn't happen over a phone call. A charter arrangement would have cost more over time and offered far less control. The math was simple, but the jet was also something else to me. Something I didn't explain to anyone, because explaining it would have required admitting how little unguarded space I had in the rest of my life. When I was on board and the door sealed shut, no one could reach me without my permission. No one could walk in with a problem to solve or a bill they needed covered. No one could look at what I had built and start calculating what they were entitled to. The cabin was quiet in a way that the rest of my life never quite was a deep, contained quiet that I had learned to guard the way you guard something you know you can't replace. It was the one place where my time was unambiguously mine, and I protected that fact the same way I protected everything else that mattered quietly and without making a speech about it. I made the mistake of occasionally bringing family along. A trip here, a long weekend there. My parents flew with me a handful of times. Sabrina and her husband Trevor joined once when I had a gap in the schedule. The kids, Sabrina's 2, sat in the wide seats and pressed their faces to the windows and asked questions about how high we were flying, and I answered every one. Those were good hours. I don't want to pretend otherwise. There was something real in those moments, something uncomplicated, and I held on to it. But somewhere in the repetition of those trips, a phrase entered the family's vocabulary that I noticed and did not correct. They started calling it the family jet. Offhandedly, casually, the way you might refer to a vacation house that everyone has used enough times to stop thinking of it as belonging to any one person. I heard it and let it pass. I thought the distinction was obvious enough that it didn't need stating. That was my miscalculation, and it was not a small one. When I arrived at the private hangar at Fort Lauderdale Executive Airport on the morning everything changed, I was already thinking about the meetings waiting for me on the other side of the Atlantic. I had a schedule. I had a crew. I had a plan. What I did not have was any warning about what my family had arranged inside that hangar while I was in transit. The doors were open. There were flowers near the entrance, white arrangements, the kind you'd order for a celebration. A photographer stood off to one side with a camera bag. There was champagne in a bucket near the stairs. And tied to the nose of my aircraft, my $68 million aircraft, registered to my holding company, insured under my name, fueled and maintained at my expense, was an enormous gold bow. I stood in the entrance and looked at it for a moment before I understood what I was seeing. Not the bow itself. What the bow meant. Someone had looked at something that belonged entirely to me and decided it was available to be given away. Sabrina was standing at the foot of the air stairs with Trevor and both children. She was already in travel clothes. My mother Marlene was positioned slightly behind them, beaming in the particular way she beamed when she had organized something she was proud of. My father Gerald stood with his hands in his pockets and the relaxed posture of a man who had already run the numbers and found them satisfactory. I looked at all of them and felt the specific coldness that comes not from surprise but from recognition, the feeling of finally seeing clearly, something you had been half seeing for a very long time. They had, I learned in the next few minutes, decided to give Sabrina the jet. Not invite her to use it, not schedule a trip as a gift. Give it. My mother used that word clearly and without hesitation. This was a gift for Sabrina, she explained, because Sabrina had a husband and 2 children and a life that required room to grow. Gerald added that Sabrina and Trevor were looking to expand their network internationally and that a private aircraft would open doors that simply weren't accessible otherwise. Sabrina nodded along and mentioned that she'd already been thinking about Monaco and Paris for the first trip. Trevor had already spoken to the crew. There was talk of redoing part of the interior to better reflect Sabrina's preferences. Not one sentence of that conversation had been run by me. My mother closed her case with a phrase I had heard in different forms my entire life. She said I mostly used the jet for work anyway. The way she said it, the logic was self-evident. Sabrina had a family. I had a business. Business was not a family. Therefore, Sabrina's needs were more fundamental. Therefore, my aircraft belonged more naturally in her hands. I had heard that reasoning before, applied to smaller things, and I had let it pass each time. This time I did not. I stood in that hangar and felt something that I am still working to describe accurately. It wasn't rage, though rage was in there. It was more like clarity. The kind that arrives when you finally see the full shape of something you have been looking at in pieces for years. Every allowance, every vehicle payment, every rescue of Trevor's business ideas, every advance to Sabrina that was never repaid, every country club invoice, every yacht charter, every household staff arrangement, none of it had registered in my family's accounting as generosity. It had registered as precedent. And somewhere between the first time I helped and that morning in the hangar, my willingness to give had been reclassified in their minds as a permanent feature of how things worked. They were not trying to steal from me. I want to be precise about that because the distinction matters. They genuinely believed, all four of them, standing there with the photographer and the champagne and the gold bow, that if they wanted something enough and presented it confidently enough, I would eventually agree, because I always had before. I looked at the bow. I looked at Sabrina, who was already checking her phone. I looked at my father, who seemed faintly proud of himself. I looked at my mother, who had the composed satisfaction of someone who had planned a successful event. Then I asked a simple question. I asked who owned the aircraft. No one answered. I asked who had paid for it. The registration, the insurance, the hangar lease, the maintenance contracts, the crew salaries, the fuel on the jet they were standing next to. Gerald started to say something about the family. My mother said what she always said when this territory came up. She said I could afford it. That phrase had done its job on me many times before. It had redirected my objections, softened my decisions, and sent me back to writing checks I hadn't planned to write. But in that hangar, with the gold bow still tied to the nose of my aircraft, and a photographer waiting for a moment that was never going to happen, that phrase did something different. It didn't make me feel guilty. It made me understand that the problem had never been about this jet. The problem was that nothing I owned had ever been treated as fully mine. Every asset I held was implicitly available for renegotiation if the family needed it enough and applied the right pressure. I told them clearly that Sabrina would not be receiving the aircraft. Then I told them the rest. Gerald and Marlene would no longer have access to the jet under any informal arrangement. The monthly allowance I had been covering would end. The chauffeur service, the country club membership, the vehicle leases, the household staff, the yacht charters, the international vacations, I would not be renewing or continuing any of it. The villa in Palm Beach, which my parents occupied at a cost they had never been asked to contribute to, would not be extended when the current term concluded. Trevor would need to resolve his own financial obligations without my involvement. Any advances to Sabrina that had never been repaid would not be followed by further ones. I said all of that without raising my voice. I also said what I would not be removing. The health coverage my parents needed during the transition would remain in place. The education accounts I had set up for Sabrina's children would not be touched. Going forward, any support for the children would be handled directly, not routed through Sabrina or Trevor. My mother started crying before I finished speaking. Gerald told me I was overreacting. Sabrina said I was tearing the family apart. Trevor called me a control freak, which I found remarkable given the circumstances. They cycled through the available arguments quickly, that I was punishing the children, that I was being vindictive, that the family had always shared what they had, that I was changing the rules without warning. I said one thing in response, and I meant every word of it. I told them I was not taking their life away. I was simply no longer paying for it. They left the hangar as a group, the way they had arrived. Marlene and Gerald walked out first. Sabrina followed, pulling the children along. Trevor went last, and he said something as he passed me that I didn't respond to. I stayed where I was. The photographer had packed up and left at some point during the conversation. The champagne was still in the bucket. The gold bow was still on the aircraft. I stood in the quiet of that hangar for a long time before I asked a crew member to remove it. Then I called Diane Holloway, who had been my attorney for years, and told her what had happened. She didn't ask me to slow down or reconsider. She asked me which changes I wanted implemented first. I told her to start with the hangar access codes. Diane Holloway worked fast. That was one of the things I had always valued about her. She did not treat urgency as a problem to manage. She treated it as information about what needed to happen next, and then she made it happen. Within 24 hours of my call from the hangar, the access codes had been changed. The crew received written notification that authorization for any flight now ran exclusively through me or through the flight operations office I had designated. The passenger list was restructured from scratch. No standing family privileges, no informal arrangements carried over from previous trips. Everything that had accumulated through years of casual permission was formally dissolved, and the documentation made clear that nothing on that aircraft moved without my explicit sign-off. While Diane worked through the aircraft, I worked through the rest. I contacted the country club and removed my payment information from the account my parents had been using. I called the chauffeur company my mother relied on several times a week and let them know the billing relationship was ending. The household staffing agency received notice that the arrangement would not continue past the current pay period. The vehicle leases came next. Then the yacht charter company, which had a seasonal booking on file that I canceled without rebooking. I went through every recurring charge methodically, the way I would have gone through any operational budget that needed restructuring, because that was ultimately what this was. I had been running a second operation in parallel with my actual business, and I had never once called it what it was. The calls and messages from my family started the same evening and did not let up for days. My mother called multiple times in a single morning, leaving voicemails that started as appeals and moved into accusations, and then circled back to appeals again, sometimes within the same message. Gerald sent texts that were longer than he usually wrote carefully constructed arguments about family obligation and the responsibilities that came with being the one who had done well. Sabrina sent voice messages, and the particular weapon she chose was the children. She described how confused they were, how they didn't understand why things had changed, how the oldest had asked why they hadn't heard from me. Trevor went a different direction and focused on practical damage. He had apparently made commitments that relied on access to the jet, and he seemed to believe that telling me this would reverse my decision. I did not respond to any of it, not because I was punishing them with silence, but because there was nothing to negotiate. The decision had been made. The steps were already in motion. I had learned over many years that responding to pressure with explanation only created more surface area for argument, and I had no interest in arguing. I had stated my position clearly in the hangar. Everything after that was their process to work through, not mine to manage. What I hadn't fully anticipated was how quickly the infrastructure of their daily life would begin to register the change. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in small, separate moments, each one a practical consequence arriving in its own time. The country club sent Gerald a statement requesting direct payment for the upcoming quarter. The chauffeur service contacted my mother to ask for updated billing information before her next scheduled pickup. The household staff asked Marlene directly who would be handling payroll going forward. Each of these moments was its own quiet confrontation with a reality that had been cushioned for a very long time. I had not designed these moments as punishment. They were simply what happened when a subsidy ended. The real cost of things began to appear, and it appeared in the most ordinary and unavoidable way possible, through invoices and billing calls and staff asking reasonable questions that no one in my family had ever had to answer before. About 3 weeks after the hangar, my father came to find me. He came to the hangar, which I thought was either deliberate or instinctive, returning to the place where things had broken open, as if the geography still held some possibility. He came alone. No Marlene, no Sabrina, no Trevor. He was dressed simply, and he looked like a man who had been sleeping poorly, which I recognized because I had seen that look on him before during difficult years, though it had been a long time since those years. He asked if we could talk, and I said yes, and we sat in the small office adjacent to the hangar floor with the aircraft visible through the glass. Gerald said he wanted things to go back to normal. He used that word normal, and I asked him what normal had actually looked like, because I was genuinely curious which version of events he was using as his reference point. He said Marlene was struggling. He said she had stopped accepting invitations from friends because she didn't want to explain why certain things in their life had changed. He said the house felt different and that the people around them had begun to notice. I told him that I had been humiliated in that hangar. I told him that my family had arranged a celebration to give away something they did not own, in front of a photographer, with champagne, and that not one of them had thought to consider how that might feel to the person whose name was on every document attached to that aircraft. Gerald didn't argue with that. He sat with it, and then he said something I had not expected. He said he had known the jet wasn't theirs to give. I asked him to say that again, and he did. He said he had known, going into that morning, that the aircraft belonged to me, that what they were doing was not a legitimate gift because none of them had anything to give. He had agreed to it anyway, because he had calculated the same way the rest of them had, that I would be upset for a while and then I would let it go. He said they had all seen me draw lines before, and they had learned, over time, that my lines moved, that my anger had a ceiling, that if they waited it out, I would come back around. He looked at me across that small desk and said the thing that had needed to be said for a very long time. He said they had known I would say no. They had just never believed my no would stay no. That sentence did something to me that I am still processing. The problem had never been a misunderstanding. My family had not failed to see my limits. They had seen them clearly, measured them carefully, and concluded that those limits had no real consequence. Every time I had eventually relented, every time a no became fine, but just this once I had been teaching them that the lesson to take from my refusal was patience, not respect. The fault was not entirely theirs. I had participated in building that pattern quietly across many years because holding the line had always cost more in the short term than giving in. I had chosen the easier thing too many times, and each time I did, the easier thing got harder to refuse the next time around. Gerald apologized. Not in the way he sometimes had before, where the apology was more of a tone than a statement. He apologized for the jet. He apologized for treating my success as a shared resource he could draw from without permission. He apologized for the years of reasoning that Sabrina's needs were more legitimate than my rights, that having a husband and children somehow entitled her to things I had worked to build. He apologized for leaning on my finances so long that the leaning had become invisible to him, so normal it had stopped feeling like leaning at all. He apologized for using the word strong as a reason to ask more of me instead of as a reason to protect me more carefully. I accepted the apology. I want to be clear about that, because accepting it mattered. I did not hold it at arm's length or qualify it into nothing. My father was sitting across from me saying specific, honest, difficult things, and I received them. Then he asked if that meant we could go back. I told him no. I told him it meant we had a chance to go forward. Going back would have meant restoring arrangements that had produced exactly this result. Going forward meant something had to be different, not punitive, not hostile, but genuinely different. The money would not return. The lifestyle infrastructure would not be rebuilt. The new terms were not a negotiation. They were simply what came next. My mother's adjustment took longer and followed a less direct path. Marlene had social architecture, the way some people have instincts. It was how she processed the world, how she measured her position in it, how she made sense of her days. The country club had not been entertainment to her. It had been a location where she was known, where the staff recognized her, where her presence carried weight. Losing those things was not, for Marlene, just a financial change. It was a change in how she appeared to the people around her, and that was something she experienced as real loss. She went through several phases. There were calls to extended family members, people I had only seen at weddings and holidays, who then called me to explain my obligations in terms that suggested they had heard only one side of the story. I answered each of those calls once, briefly, and said the same thing every time. If they believed my parents' lifestyle was a necessity, they were welcome to help fund it. Most of those conversations ended quickly. There was a period where Marlene was telling people I had changed, that success had made me cold, that I was not the daughter she had raised. I didn't respond because responding would have suggested there was something to argue about, and there wasn't. The facts were simple, and no amount of reframing changed them. What shifted Marlene was not a confrontation, it was exhaustion. After weeks of working every available lever and finding that none of them moved anything, she went quiet, not the quiet of acceptance, but the quiet of someone who has run out of moves and is finally sitting still long enough to think. It was in that stillness that something began to change in her. She started looking at the actual numbers of her life, what things cost, what they had, what was genuinely sustainable, and the arithmetic was clarifying in a way that pressure and persuasion never had been. There is something about being forced to confront the real cost of your own life that cuts through the noise faster than any argument. She called me one evening when the campaign had gone quiet, and she spoke without the architecture of persuasion that had framed most of our recent exchanges. She said she had been thinking about the way she had always categorized her daughters, Sabrina, as the one who needed care, me as the one who could handle things, and that she had never questioned it because it had always seemed true. Sabrina had struggled more visibly. I had managed more quietly, and in that gap, my mother had made a decision she had never consciously made. She had decided that capable meant sufficient. That I could handle things meant I didn't need much. That my strength was a sign I was already whole. She said something I had spent years waiting to hear, though I hadn't known I was waiting. She said that being capable didn't mean I needed them less. I accepted that too. Not as a strategy, not as a way to lower the temperature, but because it was true. The conversation didn't restore anything material. But it returned something harder, to name the feeling that my mother was actually seeing me, maybe for the first time. Sabrina was another matter. Without the flights, without the financial safety net, without the social position that had come as a secondary benefit of my resources, Sabrina's anger concentrated rather than dispersed. She had always processed difficulty outward, looking for the source of a problem in someone else's choices, and I had become the most available explanation. She told people I was punishing her. She described my decisions as vindictive, disproportionate, controlling. Trevor, who had taken a stable salaried position because there was no longer a number to call when a venture ran into trouble, reinforced this interpretation at home. I heard fragments of it through Gerald over several months, enough to understand the shape of what was happening without needing every detail. The hardest part was not Sabrina's anger. The hardest part was the children. She began limiting contact, not in any formal sense, but in the quiet way that a person controls access when they want to make a point. Fewer responses to messages. Schedule conflicts that hadn't existed before, visits that were suggested and then redirected. The education accounts I had established for the children remained intact and fully funded, with support going to them directly, bypassing Sabrina and Trevor entirely. But the access itself, the hours with them, the phone calls, the ordinary afternoons became harder to reach. One evening, several months after the hangar, I boarded the aircraft for a transatlantic crossing. The flight was scheduled for work meetings in London and then Geneva, and the cabin was quiet in the way I had always appreciated. The crew went through their checks. The lights were low. The seats stretched empty in front of me, and for the first time in my adult life, that emptiness did not feel like freedom. It felt like the answer to a question I hadn't wanted to ask. I had protected the aircraft. The title was clear, the access was controlled, the bow was long gone. I had protected every asset, redrawn every line, and held every position I had said I would hold. I had done all of it correctly. And sitting in that cabin with a photograph of Sabrina's children on my phone, a picture from 2 years before, all of us in this same cabin, the older one pressing her face to the window, I understood that being right and being okay were not the same thing. I could not make Sabrina into a different person. I could not compel an apology from someone who had decided I was the villain of her story. I could not reach the children through a door their mother had chosen to partially close. I had spent my whole life being the capable one, the one who found solutions, the one who made difficult things work. But there was no solution here that I could build with effort. Some things you cannot fix. You can only decide what you're willing to lose in order to stay honest. That was the loneliest thing I had ever known, and I sat with it for the entire flight. I have thought many times about what it actually takes for someone to change. Not adjust, not comply under pressure, not temporarily modify their behavior while waiting for circumstances to shift back in their favor, but genuinely change from somewhere underneath the surface where it is difficult and slow and not guaranteed to look like anything recognizable at first. I thought about it during the months when my family was reconfiguring itself around the absence of what I had been providing. I thought about it on the flights, when the cabin felt emptier than it used to. I thought about it when Gerald called with updates about Marlene, or when I sent the quarterly education fund statement to the trust account and heard nothing back from Sabrina's side. I could not answer the question with any confidence. I only knew that I had seen real change happen in business, not often, but sometimes, and that when it did, It arrived quietly and from an unexpected direction, usually after someone had spent a long time being certain they were fine and discovered they were not. Almost a year after the morning in the hangar, Sabrina sent me a message. It was short and did not explain itself. She said she wanted to meet not at the villa, not at the club, not at the hangar, somewhere neutral, somewhere ordinary. She named a restaurant in Fort Lauderdale, a small place near the waterfront that neither of us had any history with. She said she would come alone. I read the message twice, then I said yes. We met on a Tuesday afternoon when the restaurant was quiet. Sabrina was already at the table when I arrived. She was dressed simply and looked like someone who had been thinking carefully about what they were going to say and was no longer entirely sure it was enough. There was something different in the way she held herself, less defended, less positioned, that I noticed before she said a word. Trevor was not there. That fact registered before I even sat down, not as a relief exactly, but as meaningful information. She had come without the buffer, without the secondary voice that had always amplified her grievances and helped her maintain the version of events that cast her as the wronged party. Whatever she was about to say, she had decided to say it as herself, without reinforcement. We ordered coffee. For a few minutes, neither of us said anything substantive, not from awkwardness, exactly, but from the particular weight that settles between two people who both know the conversation they are about to have is one they can't walk back from. Then Sabrina put both hands around her cup and looked at me steadily and said she had always known the plane wasn't hers. I let her continue. She said she had known, standing in that hangar with the bow on the aircraft and the photographer behind her and Trevor talking to the crew, that none of it was legitimate. She had not been confused about ownership. She had not misunderstood whose name was on the registration. She had simply made the same calculation everyone else in that building had made, that I would eventually give way, because that was what I had always done. But where Gerald had described that morning as a collective failure of judgment, Sabrina went somewhere more uncomfortable. She described what she had actually wanted and why, and she did not make it flattering. She said she had not needed transportation. She and Trevor had resources enough for commercial flights, and their lives did not require the kind of movement across continents that had justified my purchase in the first place. What she had wanted was the image, the photographs, the impression it would make on their social circle, the way Trevor's business contacts would receive them differently. The feeling of being the kind of woman who arrived by private aircraft, who stepped off a jet onto a tarmac in Monaco and let people draw their own conclusions about what her life was. She had wanted what people would think about her when they saw her, and she had been willing to reach for something that didn't belong to her in order to have it. She said it plainly, without softening it, and I could see what it cost her to say it that way. That was harder to hear than anger would have been. Anger I had been managing for months. This was something else, my sister sitting across a small table and handing back the version of herself that had kept her comfortable and doing it voluntarily. It took a kind of honesty I had not been certain she possessed. She apologized for the jet. She apologized for the way she had leaned on her children as justification, framing them as the reason for things she had wanted for herself, as though their existence made her desires more legitimate than mine. She apologized for the months after the hangar when she had limited my access to the kids as a way of expressing an anger she didn't know how else to manage. She said she had known, even while she was doing it, that using them that way was wrong. She apologized for the advances that had never been repaid, for accepting assistance as though it were simply owed, for watching me cover the costs of her family's life, and feeling entitled rather than grateful. She said she had told herself for a long time that I didn't mind because I never said I did. And she said she had known, on some level, that the reason I never said it was not because there was nothing to say. When she finished, I asked her one question. What did she want from me now? She said she wanted her sister. Not the money, not the flights, not the rescue operations or the monthly transfers. She said those things clearly and specifically, because she understood that I needed to hear the list of what she was not asking for before I could hear what she was. She wanted to know if there was still a version of us, of our relationship, that could exist without the financial structure she had allowed to grow up between us, like scaffolding that had gradually been mistaken for the building itself. She wanted to know if the building was still there. I told her yes. I told her that was something I could give her. And then I told her what I could not give her, would not give her, regardless of circumstance or the passage of time. I would not be her financial safety net again. I would not cover the shortfalls of Trevor's ventures or extend advances that would not be repaid or quietly absorb costs that neither of them had earned the right to expect me to carry. The education accounts for her children would remain, and any support for the children would continue to flow to them directly, but the money that had moved from my accounts to hers as a matter of habit and expectation was finished. That was not a punishment. It was the permanent new condition of whatever relationship we were going to build. She needed to understand that clearly before we built anything. Sabrina said she understood. And I believed her not because people who have caused harm are automatically trustworthy when they apologize, but because she had come to that table alone, surrendered the comfortable version of events, and named every specific thing she had done wrong without being prompted. That is a different kind of conversation than the ones I had been navigating for the past year. We talked for another hour and a half, about small things, eventually, about the children, who had apparently been asking about me with a frequency that Sabrina had not found comfortable to report. About Gerald and Marlene, whom Sabrina described with an honesty that surprised me. She said the move from the villa had actually seemed to relieve my father in some way she hadn't expected, as though the scale of what they had been living inside had carried its own quiet pressure that none of them had noticed until it lifted. She said Marlene was learning things she should have known for decades, and that watching her mother figure out a household budget was both difficult and oddly clarifying. As for Trevor, Sabrina said it simply, without drama. He had kept the stable job. He had stopped coming to her with ideas that needed outside funding. Whether that represented genuine change or simply the pragmatic acceptance of a closed door, she couldn't fully say. But their household was quieter, more deliberate, and they were managing it together in a way they hadn't before. I listened to all of it and found, to my own surprise, that I believed most of what she was telling me. The road back was not a single conversation. I want to be accurate about that because the story of repair is less satisfying than the story of rupture, and it is easier to describe the moment of apology than the months of small and awkward work that followed it. Gerald had taken on consulting work, reaching back into the industrial distribution contacts he had let go dormant during the years when my resources had made additional income feel unnecessary. He worked with the particular diligence of someone who has rediscovered that effort produces something, not just income, but a sense of occupation that the dream life had slowly hollowed out. Marlene managed their household budget with an attention she had once considered beneath her, and she found, to her own surprise, that the smaller life had room in it she hadn't expected. She told me once that she had forgotten what it felt like to choose something because she wanted it rather than because it projected the right image, and that relearning that was stranger and more interesting than she had anticipated. About a year after Sabrina and I had coffee in Fort Lauderdale, I invited the whole family to join me on the aircraft for a particular occasion. It was the first time any of them had been near the jet since the morning with the beau and the photographer. I noticed, when we gathered at the hangar, that the air between us was different. Not resolved into some clean and uncomplicated version of itself. Families don't work that way, and ours had too much history for any single trip to neutralize it. But different in the ways that actually matter. Gerald confirmed with me before he mentioned to anyone else that he'd like to bring someone along. Marlene spoke to the crew with a consideration she had not previously shown them, treating them as people doing a job rather than extensions of a service she was entitled to receive. Trevor did not once suggest a way the flight could be useful for a contact of his. These were small things. They were also the only things that mean something, because small things done consistently are how changed behavior becomes visible over time. Sabrina walked with me to the foot of the air stairs. The door above us was open. The crew was ready. Everything was prepared in the same way it was always prepared, and the aircraft looked exactly as it always had, long and quiet and capable of crossing an ocean. Sabrina stood at the bottom step and did not move. She was waiting not because she didn't know how stairs worked, but because she understood something now that she hadn't understood before. She was waiting because access was not something she assumed anymore. It was something she received when it was offered, and she had learned the difference between those two things at a cost she would not forget. I looked down at her and said, "Come aboard." She smiled and walked up the stairs, and I followed her, and that was that. We gathered at the hangar again sometime later, not for a trip, just for a quiet evening together before a flight. I was taking the following morning. There was no champagne, no photographer, no beau. Just the people who had found their way back to each other after a year of hard weather, sitting together in a space that had once been the location of one of the worst mornings I had known. Gerald stood at some point, the way he sometimes did when he had been holding something long enough that he needed to finally set it down by saying it. He looked at me and said that for years they had called me independent when what they had actually meant was convenient. He said they had used my strength as a reason not to protect my softness, and my success as a resource to plan around rather than a life to respect. He said they had been proud of what I built, and had then, gradually and without fully meaning to, begun calculating how much of it could be redirected toward what they wanted. He said they should have celebrated what was mine. Instead, for too many years, they had kept asking how much of it could become theirs. I cried. Not quietly and not briefly, and I did not try to manage it into something more composed. I cried because those words named something that had been living in me without language for 30 years. And naming a thing does not heal it immediately, but it changes the weight of it. It makes it possible, finally, to put down. After dinner, one of Sabrina's children found me standing outside near the aircraft. She was at the age where questions come without preamble, honest and direct in the way that children are before they learn to soften things. She looked up at the jet and then at me and asked if she thought she could own something like that one day. I told her that if that was what she wanted, she could build a life that got her there. She thought about it genuinely, the way children do when they're not performing contemplation, but actually doing it, and then she asked, if she bought a jet, would everybody in the family get to use it? I looked at her for a moment before I answered. I told her, only if she chose to share it. She nodded, taking it in, and turned back toward the hangar where her mother and grandparents were still talking inside. I watched her go and stayed where I was for a while, under the lights, next to the aircraft that had started all of this. And I thought about what that small exchange had contained the entire lesson of the past 2 years, passed from one generation to the next in the space of 3 sentences, without anyone having to explain why it mattered. My parents tried to give away my $68 million jet to my sister without asking me, and I think for a long time they genuinely believed they could. They had 15 years of evidence that my limits were temporary, that my anger had a ceiling, and that patience on their part would eventually be rewarded with compliance on mine. They were right about everything except the ending. What I learned, and what I think anyone in a similar position eventually has to learn, is that generosity given without limit doesn't create gratitude. It creates expectation. And once expectation sets in, the person giving is no longer seen as generous. They're seen as a resource. The giving becomes invisible, and only the stopping becomes visible, which is why the person who finally says enough is always the one accused of causing damage. But the damage was never in the stopping. The damage was in all the years of not stopping, and the slow erosion that comes from being treated as a supply line rather than a person. I did not pull the plug on their dream life to punish anyone. I did it because I needed to know, and they needed to discover whether there was a real family underneath all of it, or only a financial arrangement dressed in the language of love. The answer turned out to be yes, there was a family. It was smaller and quieter and less photogenic than the one we had been performing. It required each of them to show up without the cushion my resources had provided. It required me to hold a position long enough for everyone, including myself, to believe it was real. But it was real. And for the first time in a very long time, every person who walked through the door of my life had chosen to be there, not because of what I could provide, but because of who I actually was. If any part of this story felt familiar, if you've ever been the capable one, the strong one, the one everyone assumed would figure it out, I hope it offered something useful. Not a blueprint, because every family is different and every situation carries its own weight. But maybe a reminder that the word no is not the end of a relationship. Sometimes it is the only thing honest enough to show you what the relationship was actually made of. And sometimes, if the people involved are willing to do the hard work of looking clearly at what they find, it becomes the beginning of something more real than what came before. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe. There are more stories like this one, and every single one of them is worth your time.